I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we're each on and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm Matt Finch, and on this special one-off podcast, I'll be talking with three guests about thinking through photography, what it means to explore our relationship to photographs, whether it's making them, exhibiting them, viewing and responding to them, and what we can learn from our relationship to that medium. The three guests I'll introduce now are Wendy Catling, an Australian visual artist working primarily in photography. Motivated by personal and wider histories, her work takes a reparative approach to revealing the complexities of domestic violence, focusing on shame, memory, power, and intergenerational trauma. Wendy, welcome.
Thank you.
Alongside Wendy, we have Dr. Natasha Barrett, who is Research Librarian for Digital Materials at the Alexander Turnbull Library within the National Library of New Zealand, Te Puna, Mātauranga or Aotearoa. But she has also worked as a senior curator, a historic heritage advisor, and a repatriation researcher alongside being a photographer in her own right. Natasha's PhD thesis focused on the meanings and uses of colonial era photographs of Māori and multi-sensory methods for interpreting photographs in exhibitions. Natasha, it's good to have you with us.
You're Matt.
And Jonathan Bart is a London-based filmmaker and photographer. He's currently writing his next feature screenplay to follow up his micro-budget debut feature, Fluid, while learning more about lighting and composition in photography. And he's also author of A Beginner's Guide to Landscape Photography. Jonathan, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I thought the first thing I'd like to ask all of you is about your first experiences of photography. If you think back, when was the first time you laid your hands on a photograph? And when was the first time that you yourself took a photograph? I wondered, when you look back to your earliest past, what was your first contact with this medium?
Oh, shall I
Go ahead.
My first experience with photography, I suppose, was my mother and a sort of box brownie style camera, which was used very rarely and only used for photographs of special family occasions. And, you know, the camera would be sitting around for quite long periods, you know, with this partially exposed film in it. And then now and again sent off for processing, and you'd get back these images that had been taken months or sometimes years before. And then those, you know, physical black and white photographs would be, you know, carefully mounted in an album. There was also, you know, the collection of albums my mum had, and my father, not so much. He kind of had a few loose photographs floating around in various places, but, you know, wasn't really a collector of them. And then the first time I took a photograph, that's a really good question. I may have been allowed to use the family camera now and again, but it wasn't really something that I was encouraged to do. Probably my first time taking a photograph was when I was at high school, and I did an art course, and we were allowed to borrow these old Pentax K1000 cameras, and I learned to use one of those, you know, 35mm images, and I really loved it. So that was back in the 70s, and since then I've had my own camera consistently, and used it, you know, at art school for art projects, but also for just, you know, documenting family and life.
On that high school course, Wendy, did you also get to develop the images?
Yes, yeah, we had a dark room. It was a funny place. I was unhappy at my high school, and moved after year 11 to a they called it a tertiary orientation program at a tech school, and I did 2 years there, and it was a combination between a school for apprentices learning how to be plumbers and builders, and then in the main building, and then there was this array of kind of mobile classrooms, very temporary looking, and one of those was a dark room, and so I learned how to develop and print a few photographs in there. Yeah, it was a really profoundly influential time. Moving from a standard high school to this school where I didn't have to wear a uniform, and you could call the teachers by their first name, and they had a movie club at lunchtime, and I was exposed to art films for the first time as a 17-year-old, and that was probably the making of me, although there've been hiccups in between and long periods of not feeling like I was an artist or doing any creative work. But that was what really excited me and set me on the path that I'm on now as an artist and an educator as well.
Thank you. And I guess each of you is on this path in a different way, and we're really thinking about that first moment that you stepped onto that path that you're on today. Jonathan, when you think back, what was your first encounter with the photograph and with the camera?
With the photographs, really interesting. I think they're very similar. It was seeing my parents using a Polaroid camera, which had a magical. It was I forget the model. I wrote it on a blog. But it was one where you took the photo, and then you had to pull out the thing after the exposure afterwards, and then peel it open or something like that. I never got to do that bit. I was never allowed, because I was only about 4 years old or so when they were using it. However, that was the first camera I actually used, because I had a tendency to, say, come into my parents' bedroom in the morning or whatever, and I picked it up. And the first photo I ever took was of them sleeping. It's kind of a bit odd and Freudian, but there you go. And I think the flash woke them up, and as a result, I was never allowed to touch the camera again, because I know it was about 6 a.m. And oddly, that I still love Polaroids. I have to point out, I've got this. This is mine right now, the one I use right now. And for my birthday, my sister very kindly sent me some impossible films to use in that. I still find them Polaroids quite magical. Interesting that you mentioned Pentax K1000 though, Wendy, because when I decided to get serious about photography, I was encouraged to buy one of those cameras, and I saved up some money and got the Pentax. I was about 19, and 18, 19, and I took it with me to college, and it was stolen. It was the first camera I had, which was stolen, and very sad about that. But that was really quite an eye-opener for me, and I think that was the first time I was very serious about photography. The joy of using 35mm and getting around to developing. But for me, it wasn't at school. The darkroom was years later in my, I think in my 30s, actually. I really got into using the darkroom with at this gallery up in North London with a lovely chap called Mark Cummins, a photographer who sort of ran a camera club. And after he showed me the fundamentals, he just said, okay, first 200, you won't know, first 200 exposures, you won't know what you're doing, and then you'll just get into it and so on. And that was, mid-30s really for me, quite late. Even though we had a dark room at school, it was never used, it was always locked. So Yeah, it's a strange experience, but yeah, I think my experiences are similar, but somewhat more arrested or protracted than most people's.
I love the idea that if the first 200 exposures you won't know what you're doing, why not start as a toddler and get number one in while you're there?
Absolutely. I mean, just start them early. You know, I really, yeah. Yeah, one of my favourite filmmakers, Mark started as a photographer at school. He went to this art school in Chicago or something. I think that the idea of getting that kind of experience that early, when unself-consciously, is golden. So yeah, anyone who has that is really lucky, I think.
Yeah, I think they're lucky too.
Yeah.
Natasha, what about you? Were your first experiences unself-conscious ones? What was your first encounter with a photograph and with a camera?
So my first memory is with my grandmother, who had these wonderful albums. So memories of memories, I guess that is. So she was born in South America as a child, and I loved looking at these photographs of where they lived, the whitewashed cottage, people that lived there, the pictures of my great-grandparents on horses, rounding up cattle. So my great-grandparents had gone over to set up a beef cattle ranch for Fray Bentos, who do the steak and kidney pies in a tin, which you stick in the oven. So yeah, I just loved her getting the albums out, leafing through, telling me these stories. It didn't matter if I'd heard them 3,000 times again. I wanted to hear about my great-grandfather swimming through the piranha-infested river that was depicted in the photograph, and him chopping my grandmother's one of her plaits off when she was asleep because she was really hot and she moaned, and so she then had to cut the other one off. And then there's a picture of her with short hair. So yeah, they were just wonderful ways of sort of sharing those family memories, and that sort of really unique and very different experience of her as a child. And then I think my first memories of taking some photos were actually, we did a trip. My mother's aunt died when I was about 7, and we did a trip to Australia. So quite amazing at that age. We went to Hong Kong on the way to see friends, and then Thailand, and then Australia, where we had friends as well. And I don't remember what the camera was. I think it was probably just a point and shoot that my parents had, but yeah, asking if I could take a photo, and it's kind of an odd shot. I can still remember it. We were in some sort of mall somewhere, and I took a family portrait, and there was some, nice kind of plants in the background. So kind of an odd, go to Australia and I take a picture inside a mall. But yeah, I have really, really vivid memories. And my mother encouraged me, I think because she encouraged me to make a diary and a scrapbook because I was leaving school early, and, it was quite frowned upon to, go off on holidays before term had ended. So this was the pseudo educational side. So I did a kind of scrapbook afterwards with, feathers from emus, and some of the photos went in there as well, and also got the family album. So yeah, that's my first kind of memory of taking photos. And probably like some of you guys as well, I did visual arts at university. So that was my first sort of darkroom experience. But prior to that, I remember going up Tottenham Court Road in London, which is where there used to be these amazing secondhand photography shops, and you could buy cameras. And I remember going for, it was my 18th birthday with my father, and buying a Minolta camera, which I still have and is still one of my favorites. So yeah, those kind of, photographs in themselves create memories, but the memories within the photographs, but then they create memories of the events as well that kind of surround the taking of the photographs. So yeah, some nice things to kind of reflect on.
Yeah, that your mention of leafing through the family albums and the stories attached to each photograph, that was a really big part of my childhood, because my mother, she was in New Zealand. She was born in New Zealand. Her parents were English, and they ended up in Australia. When she was in her mid-20s, took a trip to the UK, as many young descendants of English families did, young women especially. You know, a trip to the home country was sort of a common thing. And so she had these photographs of her travels on the ship, stopping at various countries, and then in the UK, and she ended up living and working there for 3 years. And you know, I would just pore over these old photographs, and you know, some of them were of our family members, and some of them are people that she met along the way. And you know, I never tired of hearing those stories. And you know, so that was, you know, sort of very influential in me feeling a connection to my heritage, I suppose.
Those albums become really precious. So I remember when my grandmother went into a home, and one of the albums got misplaced, and we were, you know, so worried that it got scooped up along with a load of newspapers and put in the rubbish or something. And then eventually, thankfully, my aunt, who's really forgetful, suddenly remembered she borrowed it. And I couldn't care less if, you know, the things of monetary value had gone, but the thought of losing those albums was just horrifying, you know.
Yes.
My grandmother was starting to deteriorate by that age, and I really regretted not doing oral histories with her. But I thought, oh gosh, if we lose the album, you know, it's just gone.
Yeah, awesome.
Jonathan, have you had the same experience? Have photographs served as a connection to somewhere that's distant in time or distant in place?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. Sadly, no. It's really strange because we're going backwards and forwards here. Looking backwards, there were lots of photos around. There were photo albums around. But they, for some reason, you know, my mother was from Trinidad and Tobago, my father was from St. Kitts and Nevis. As far as I could tell, no photo, you know, about with my brother and sister, you know, among my brothers and sisters' collections of photos, and my parents and mine, no photos exist of their youths, their youngest years in their home countries. The earliest photos I have, which I happen to just glance, were from my mother when she came over, so like Windrush generation, and she was in Gloucester, and there's photos of her at this party in the 50s. It looks lovely, lovely sort of luminous photo there. But with regards to the history with the photos, there was never a moment of, oh yeah, hey Jonathan, this was me in Gloucester, this was me and my friends here, and so on. They were, I wish I had the words for it, but they were just images, they were just photos. And they were in albums, but there was something very present tense about them. There wasn't any history attached to them. They had about as, they're almost like the photos I'm taking now, and I'm yet to sort of print them or catalogue them or something like that. The reason I said going forward or backwards is because after my mother died a couple of years ago, I got possession of all the photos she had in her flat, and they fill one of these crates behind me, and I'm yet to go through them because, you know, there's been, you know, son's birth and sorting out my mum's estate and so on. Some are in albums, many are not, many are loose, many are in bags. I think that if there's going to be a history, it's going to come along as I catalogue them. Maybe in, you know, next year or so, when I get, you know, I'll probably be able to get around to them then, and then there might be some sort of connection. I was getting very emotional listening to what both of you were saying, actually, the idea of having a connection to your culture and to your homeland, to your history, because that was very much not my experience. There was, if anything, I could best look on it with one particular photo I saw, which was taken again with that Polaroid, of my mother at a party, house party with some of her friends, who I knew them as aunties. They all look gorgeous, gorgeously dressed up, hair looking fabulous. It's during the evening, and it's in the square bordered photo, and I think it's got significance now for me. But I think for my mother and for her friends, it was a moment. And I think that's what photography was for me, a collection of moments rather than a connection to a past. So yeah, that's I think that's a very big difference, actually. Yeah, something I think about, especially now that my partner and I are building a photo album to show Miles, our son, where he's from and who his family is, and so on.
Yeah, just elaborating a little bit, the albums that my mother has kept, sort of all these years, were it wasn't just photographs. There are other items in or with the albums, things that she had collected, like coasters from the ship that she travelled to the UK on, and news clippings, a tablecloth that she started embroidering that was, I think it was a map of the world or a map of the journey printed onto cloth, and she got people that she met on board the ship to initial, and then she started embroidering their initial names, and it was never finished. So there's a whole lot of memorabilia in and around the albums, and it was a very pleasurable thing. I was one of those kids who loved looking at things. I loved reading and poring through these albums, and it was a pleasurable thing that I loved to do with my mum, to bring her back to the albums and ask her to tell me the stories associated with all of the stuff. And so they are part of that emotional connection that we had. Not just the ancestry, but because some of the stories are sad, some are happy, and there's a, as you may know from my work, they've come back again into my recent work, and the way they were used in my parents' marriage as a kind of sort of a weapon, in a sense. My father used to go through my mum's old albums and physically, violently tear out photographs of her with any male friends that she had because of his jealousy. So it's they are there is so much emotional baggage with the albums, I suppose. So I spent quite a bit of time re-examining my connection with these photographs, for the recent project.
And perhaps that's a good time to elaborate a bit on this work. Is Natasha used this phrase, memories of memories, and your work, Nightshade, Wendy, that was recently exhibited in Melbourne, digs into these family histories in different ways. I wondered if you'd just tell us a little bit about that project.
Well, it was something that I've been, it's an idea I've been working through for quite a few years, but it kind of came together in my MA studies, and the theme is domestic abuse, and the history of my mother and father's relationship. And it was a complicated project. I was using a metaphor of weeds and weed behaviours to represent the kind of dominating and aggressive behaviours of abusers. And then I was also bringing, and that came about because my mother's a lifelong gardener, and she's still very obsessive, really, about pulling out weeds in both in her own garden of native plants, but also in the local environment, where she volunteers with a bush care group, trying to prevent the native bushlands being destroyed by invasive weeds. So there was that aspect, and I was taking photographs of weeds and taking photographs of my mum weeding. And then I started looking at my own albums and then borrowing photograph albums from my mum, and just kind of trying to look back at and somehow see into the past as one uses photographs to do, and looking at photographs that my father had, the very few. And there was this day when Mum was throwing out a lot of stuff from her garage, and I noticed on the hard rubbish collection was this beautiful looking leather bound album, which I only vaguely remembered seeing a long way in the past, and it had belonged to my dad, and it was mostly empty, really. There were only a very small number of photographs and some postcards in it, but I said, "Oh, Mum, can I have that?" And she gave it to me. And just, I revisited that childhood experience of spending hours poring over the images, and then started scanning them and scanning in to small details on them. And that kind of led to this investigation of, because, in Mum's albums, there are these, very standard family photographs of, a loving, on the surface, a loving father and a loving husband, and, very normal kind of photographs of birthdays and so on. And knowing what I know about the actual relationship and the actual family history, I was just intrigued by that disconnect between the surface of the photograph and, the stories behind it. And I suppose trying to drill down into them and trying to draw something out of them that might indicate in a symbolic way that the ambiguity. So I scanned very closely lots of hand gestures of my father. He's these very, I remember his hands very well, quite solid, what you would perceive to be very masculine hands. He was a mechanic, so they were, working hands, physical working hands. And so I zoomed in on these scans and enlarged them very big, and they became intertwined with the weeds and the photographs. They were always taken outdoors, actually, because we didn't use a flash in the very early sort of 1960s photographs, and later on there were flash, different kinds of cameras and different kinds of photographs, but a lot of them were taken in gardens, as it turns out. So I have images of shadows of plants on people standing in gardens, or plants, behind them. So there seemed to be that connection too. I think I've rambled on a bit. I've forgotten whether I've answered what the question was and whether I've answered it, but that was the project, and they were some of the strands that I was exploring.
I thought there was a nice connection that I was sort of making with my PhD, looking at colonial era photographs, where you have a situation where you don't know the agency of the sitter, and whether you talk about agency, does that in itself rob people of what they might have been doing, within their own mind to rise above an oppressive regime, particularly with photographs of the sort of anthropomorphic metric style, where people were measured or put in extremely uncomfortable poses the ones I've looked at with New Zealand are far less horrendous in that nature than those in Australia and Tasmania. But I was just thinking about those parallels. You're talking about your family photographs where you don't really know what's going on, and they're giving off a certain appearance of the perfect family. And colonial era photographs, people are being posed to fit a certain ideal of race, of the noble savage, and those kind of concepts. So that idea of what's going on behind versus what's being betrayed, I thought was a nice connection that I was making with your work, and those emotions that in both cases are different but are still very heightened. And
yes, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, the way that people, the agency of the photographer in terms of the subjects being posed in a particular way, or the kind of the reverse, you know, in a family, the expectation of how one should present oneself for a photograph, and you know, what's acceptable to be captured in a photograph and what's not, and both of those things hiding so much, concealing so much. Yeah. So yeah, it's a rich area for exploration. I'm still looking at, I'm still very interested in the same subject matter for my next and future projects, and still completely fascinated by you know, the you know, what you were saying about the sort of iconography of photographs and an agency, and you know, they're never neutral. You know, they kind of on the surface appear to be neutral, but you know, they never really are neutral.
And it's those little clues that even if somebody was put in an impossible situation where they still may have, I think, you know, I think the debate sort of certainly moved on when I was doing my research, you know, from does the person have agency, but people can still have agencies in different ways. So there may be some small subtle sign or some angle of the body that they are indicating to the viewer what it is that they'd like to portray, but within the sort of confines of what they're being forced to do and how to look and how to stand.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I wonder, Natasha, if you just say a little bit more. I know in your thesis you argue that photographs can be seen to have their own life force and ancestral presence. What came out of those years of research for you?
Oh, it's hard to boil down. So for Maori, there is the concept of the past being in front. So in a Western paradigm, we think of the past being behind. But in Te Ao Maori, the Maori world, they think of the past being in front of them because their ancestors are so important. So I was sort of linking and hooking that into photographs and how they might see photographs. I also brought in, I used he's an archaeologist, anthropologist, phenomenologist called Tim Ingold. He's done a lot of work. He's quite obsessed with lines and markings. So I looked at concepts of reductive and additive traces. So the marks that are made on paper, either drilled in or added, and sort of align that with the concept that Murray believes some essence has gone into the photograph when it's captured. So there were some cases that I sort of referred to. They were auctions over here in New Zealand, and also more recently, contemporary to when I was doing my PhD anyway, from auction houses where photographs of Maori from the colonial era being sold. And I think what was interesting is that these are, if we use the Western term, are not unique, because there are glass plates over here, there's other prints around the world. But that doesn't matter. But from a Maori paradigm, they're still important, they're still there, they see them as their ancestors, and they would describe it's not just limited to photographs, it would be carvings. So it's that unique connection with the ancestor So in the instances I looked at, I think the ones over here, the auctions were halted and they went to a museum, and there was a shared, we call it kaitiaki, guardianship between museum and the local iwi, the tribe. In the UK, Aotearoa, who are the London Maori cultural group, who I did interviews with and workshops, they went to the auction house and they reconnected with the photographs, and they blessed them and they sung to them. So this is a concept that kind of comes up again and again with all cultural objects, or taonga as they are called over here. That idea of reawakening and reconnecting. It doesn't matter if they're not your tribal ancestors. They've been away from their home country for a long time, and it is that reawakening and reconnecting. Sorry, I've rambled as well. I'm not sure I've answered your question.
No, this is absolutely fascinating. Both of you saying.
One of the things that I did find, because I had a focus on exhibitions in 3 of my chapters in my thesis, was that museums in the UK, which is where I did my research at Leicester, had got the concept of objects, taonga, having this endurable connection to their descendants. They understood that, and they understood that it was important to talk to tribes over here, iwi, and get their consent to show them in an exhibition and get information on how to interpret them correctly. They understood that. But when it came to photographs, that wasn't there. And this is sort of underpinned by the way that museums and archives and other institutions, cultural institutions, view photographs and how they place them within that institutional structure. So often they're part of archives, or they're part of pictorial collections. They're never part of objects. So my big focus was materiality, that photographs do have material.
Yeah.
And so because they have this weird placement in museums and they're not seen as proper objects, the way they're used is quite different. So I think that really sort of connected with the way that these museums were treating these photographs. They understood other objects were cultural treasures, but photographs, they didn't consult. They used them. One of the terms one of the academics coined was, as visual wallpaper. It's an almost unconscious thinking around how you use photographs in exhibitions. Although, we need a backdrop, we'll just use that. The one example I can give is at the British Museum in the Wellcome Gallery. I don't know if any of you visited. They've got these enormous, they call them fish tanks, the curators. They actually hated them because they're just vast and really, really tall. And the Maori case has photographs, like all of them do, going all the way around the glass. They're sort of like decal on the outside. And the museum had been talking to Ngāti Rana, another local Māori iwi, and Te Papa back in the museum back here about how to interpret the objects. Nothing with the photographs. So it was this big black hole. So it was kind of an intro. I didn't really know where to go with it. I mean, that was my finding, that they're not putting them within that same cultural context.
Do you think that has anything to do with photographs being reproducible?
Yeah, I do think so. Yeah, so that concept of the unique original, because photographs are inherently reproducible, and digital's just made that.
Yeah, but only if. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? If when we're talking about photographs that are documented on film or glass plate, going further back, then as long as you have that is the original, then you can keep on, producing prints from it. But if that is lost, then the object, the prints become more unique, don't they? Do the Maoris have a concept of that difference between the glass plate and the paper print?
Not at all. So the auction sales that I mentioned, there's prints over here, there's glass plates of those prints that were being sold in the UK. People like Elizabeth Pullman, who was very nice, well-known female photographer who took amazing photographs, which quite different from the male portrayal. But no, it didn't matter. It doesn't matter to them. They're all important. They don't have that same, kind of differentiation that we make. And I know when I was doing my thesis, I sort of even then became worried about like throwing a photocopier away, because I've become so embroiled in this world. It's like, I don't know what to do with this photocopy now. I feel really uncomfortable putting it in the bin, and that could have been a line to go down. How far do you take that?
I completely understand that. Yeah, I totally relate to that.
Book, I felt guilty. This is somebody's ancestor, and I'm screwing this photocopy up. It becomes a sort of burden to worry about what to safely, dispose of them.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm hearing here is that like everyone involved in a photograph on either side of the lens at the moment of taking and then in its afterlife, they have different perspectives. There are different power relationships. Stories are concealed or brought to the surface. I'm really aware that all three of you are also practitioners in the sense that you take photographs for different purposes. And I'm interested in how you navigate that and maybe the tension between a staged photograph and one that feels more like a discovery. Jonathan, I was wondering, what are your thoughts when you take a photograph? How do you balance that question of whether you're setting it up or whether you're discovering something?
I'm fine. That's a really difficult question. I've never really. Well, it's not so much I've never really thought about. I suppose I could give you my understanding of that. So as a practitioner. And I think it's to do with what I like with street photography or with landscape photography. What's in front of the lens, what I'd like to record, may sometimes take in somebody else's private space. And I feel that if there is any tension there, it's about intruding on someone's private space. I live near Woolwich. There's two interesting squares, public squares in Woolwich. My partner did a project on them because Woolwich used to be the Woolwich Arsenal, where all the weaponry for the Empire was manufactured. So you've got one square named after Gordon of Khartoum, for instance. So it's that sort of thing. There's been so much change there as well, because we've gone from something celebrating General Gordon to a square which now has a Black Lives Matter painting all the way through it, as you can see from some of the towers around there. So there's been this huge change, and what I like photographing is change. But there are people's businesses there are people's homes there, and that's been changed as well, which I would love to record. I would love, there's this, I haven't seen it somewhere, the idea of mundane photos has been really fascinating because they just show a housing estate appear or something like that. I love that, but I am torn because these are individual people's spaces. They're their homes, they're their businesses, they're their private lives, they're with people they may not want to be seen with or who are precious to them. And it's intruding on that. Another example, I suppose, with personal photos is this past weekend, I took my son for his first, and probably my first, Easter egg hunt around the woods in Shooters Hill. And all the children there were children from his nursery, and all the parents there were parents I knew. But I felt, while I was taking photos of my son with his friends, I still had this feeling, I'm taking photos of other people's children. Is this okay? Now, maybe that's a bit of oversensitivity because all the other parents are doing the same thing, but that for me, I suppose, I don't know if I'll answer your question in particular, Matt, but I think that's been my tension in photography. I do want to record, but what I'm recording and what fascinates me might be someone else's possession, you know, or life or something like that. I hope my point's kind of got, I don't think I've got the words for it at all, but that's why I feel the idea of intrusion is something that has taken up a lot of my thoughts when taking particular posed, what I would call, my more crafted photos, my non-snap type photos. That's for me, definitely.
Jonathan, does it make a difference to you what your ultimate purpose is with the photograph? You know, whether it's, you know,
sure,
your own albums, or you know, in terms of where you might want to go as a photographer, you know, showing them publicly, or, you know, is that a tension? Do you differentiate between, you know, your personal photographs and the ones that you deliberately take for a wider audience?
That's a very good point. I think the ones I want for a wider audience, I want the place to be there, but the ones which I've really wanted to put out to the public have been very much devoid of people. I think so I took part in a sort of group exhibition of my camera club, and I think the photos I went for, you know, you couldn't really recognise any particular person in the photo. The ones I have on sale are of different places in London, and people are silhouetted in the sunlight. So I won't really want to have that. However, I think some of my you know, the group exhibition were mainly photos I did over a holiday in Paris some years back. And my favourite photo is one from I think the Orangery Gallery. And there are these two young women who are sort of walking in the photo. They seem to be walking towards the camera, but they're just walking behind me, you know, to an image behind me. But the expression on their faces, they're rapt, they're interested, they're sort of teenage, and they're just like really enjoying the gallery. But as far as I'm concerned, that's going to go no further because it's these two young women in a photograph. I can't use them in that way. That's my photo, and it stops. You know, buck stops with me there. It doesn't go. It's not going online. It won't go any further. Even though I really like the photo, and the composition's lovely and so on. I can only think. It's been a very unconscious thought process, I think. I always think of that moment in Lawrence of Arabia when the photojournalist takes a photo of Aotearoa Abbey Time. He points to the camera and says, "Am I in that?" You know, and I think it's the element of somebody being in those photos and I'm taking something from them. I've never felt particularly comfortable with that. So, yeah, my most public images, and I think, you know, apart from one example when I was taking a photo in a square in Edinburgh, and some drunk people from a party said, "Hey, take our photo," you know, and I took their photo, and they were happy for it. I think if you look through most of my photos online, apart from that one, they're absolutely devoid of people. I don't think they're more about places. And I feel very comfortable about places rather than bringing people into it.
Because this is a debate within street photography circles, I believe, at the moment. You know,
okay.
That aspect of exploitation and intrusion and so on. And I know in my recent reading about documentary and new documentary photography as well, there's this growing sense of, and you would understand this too, Natasha, of the need, like the need to work ethically, and the most ethical way to work with photographs of other people is to collaborate with them and to photograph situations that you're more directly involved in, rather than coming in as an outsider and overlaying your outsider's perspective on something.
Yeah, I think it's the issue, picks up with what we talked about with agency. So it's being a voyeur, isn't it, on a scene that you're intruding, but it's also the consent, which obviously has, it's very topical at the moment. So I think this is the same as you, Jonathan. When I do my, hobby photography, I don't mind shooting people from a distance where you can't really see, or if it's close up and it's from behind. But when I have taken close-ups, I've gone up and asked them, and sometimes that means people go no. But I'm okay with that, because sometimes it means you get a great shot because they're really into being photographed and they really engage. But yeah, I feel really uncomfortable. I have friends who do great street photography, but I can't do it. I don't feel comfortable.
It's so strange, because I absolutely agree with you. I've never I have asked permission for some photos. But even when I've got the permission and I've got the photo and it looks fabulous, I still don't want to make it public. It's because I still think I've taken something from them. I'm still using this young person or this group, this family or something like that. I don't know why that is. But the other part of it is that I love looking at these images. I absolutely, there's one stream on Instagram called the Bumpkin Files, where somebody is collecting all the photos of black British people not in London from the past. So black people in Sheffield, Cardiff, and so on. And there are these fantastic photos of people just doing ordinary things in the 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and probably 80s. They're amazing photos. I bought this book of photos for my partner of Dalston, the Dalston area of London, in mainly in the mid-80s, and it's this extraordinary history. And you look at these people with it, and the archive is amazing. I love looking at these photos. I just feel really uncomfortable about taking them. And some of these photos had consent. A lot of them did. Some of them didn't. Some of them, the Wolfgang Szyszewski photos, I dare say he was just photographing what he saw in London. I love them. I absolutely love them. But I just couldn't, I really feel uncomfortable about doing it myself. I don't know. I need to interrogate that, because there's something going on there.
So that's why you're attracted to the landscape then, Jonathan? Absolutely.
I feel the landscape, I feel that, landscapes, it's harmless. I don't feel that I'm doing any harm. I feel I am recording. Imagine, so I really love Trafalgar Square, for instance. I think it's an extraordinary place, but I've got like a number of photos from when I started taking photos seriously, from the late 80s to photos now, and the difference of seeing a road going all the way around it to the pedestrianised area now is fascinating. And I'm happy with that aspect of sort of urban landscape. What I'm not happy with is the destitute man in one particular photo who is in focus. It's although that is part of the history of the area. To conclude, that is why I look for the landscape. the changes in the area as opposed to the changes in the people. I feel a lot more comfortable about photographing that. But if I may continue, just one thing which was in the introduction while I'm trying to look into composition, I'm trying to learn more about cinematic composition. I read somewhere it's the relation of the person to the landscape and the horizon, which is really important in good cinematography. So I may have to get back into looking at people again in photographs. I may have to get over that particular hurdle, or I should just start posing people. But that's for the future.
That brings back to Matt's question, doesn't it? You know, the staged photograph versus spontaneous. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask one more thing of that, of Jonathan, actually, because you directed this movie Fluid, and I know you shot it on a Fuji X Pro, which is also a stills camera. Just briefly on that relationship between your experience as a photographer and then your experience shooting cinema, was there a relationship there?
There is, and it's about it's about two things. One fundamental thing is movements of the composition, movements of the camera to move the composition, move the image around. The idea of the moving photograph is there was a really big difference there, I think. And I know that for the early sets of shots in the film, I was very static towards the. Before I go on, I have to say, we really didn't know what we were doing. I really was guessing. I was really learning as I went along in this film, and I think that as the shot progressed, the movement of the camera became more and more important. Even if it was just a slight, this wasn't a step, it was just really the most basic camera rig I had, but just a slight move in on a particular character or site or something like that, that became quite significant. I'd like to return to that in a second. There was also the idea of setting up different compositions of the same character. There's one particular moment I shot with a friend where he's taking a phone call on a bridge in the city of London. And I remember taking about 8 or 9 setups of this particular particular scene. And I think there was the variety of compositions I was looking at, the variety of setups, which, should it be a photograph, there would be, for me, one photo. I think that was the so there was camera movement and the amount of setups, which was very much part of the difference between film and between shooting a film and shooting a photograph.
I think that tension between the technical aspects of photography and then the artistic effects one might be trying to achieve, or what a situation offers you, are one of the most fascinating aspects of this medium. We've had such a lively conversation. There's so many other roads we can go down, but I want to round up with just 2 questions to all of you. And as Natasha's reminded us, actually our notion of time is very culturally dependent. So in my mind, this is one question looking backwards and one question looking forward, but it may not be the case. There's a great book edited by Will Stacey called Photographs Not Taken. And it's a series of essays by photographers about times that they didn't press the button and take the shot. And given what we've been saying about photography as an intrusion, the ethics of photography, I wondered for each of you, looking back, have there been times where you chose not to take a photograph? And I can see Natasha nodding, so I might ask her first.
Yeah, just recently, actually, I went back to Auckland, where I used to live, and it's like being a tourist when you go back somewhere. But like when I go back to London, it's odd. And yeah, I was at Auckland Museum outside, ready to go in, and there was a perfect shot with a family there, kind of excited kids, and it would have made a great shot. But yeah, I didn't feel comfortable taking it for those issues of sort of consent and feeling comfortable with it. So yeah, it's hard. It's that we've talked about memories, but it's the absence as well, isn't it? I know, Jonathan, you talked about having an absence of photographs, that Wendy and I sort of share that connection, and I guess this is an absence of photographs we haven't taken, which is quite a nice sort of connection, but we still have the memory of them, I guess. But you know, I don't know if you guys do this as well. You have the frame in your head. So if I'm doing a long shoot, I often end up with this like frame head where I'm sort of walking around and I'm not seeing the world normally, because I've become so into the viewfinder that all I see is that. So yeah.
Yes. Photographs not taken. I've got many of those remembered shots that I wish I'd had the camera there. I didn't have the camera, or shots where I failed to take what I saw in my head because I, fumbling to get the right camera settings, or, chose not to for, ethical reasons. I had an interesting situation on this last project I worked on that I was talking about, where, in trying to explore my mother and my parents' history, I started trying to take portrait photographs of my mother, and I was, learning portrait skills as I went along. But I had the cooperation of my mum in this project, and I felt like we were collaborators on it, but she's very, very uncomfortable in front of a camera, partly because of aging and feeling self-conscious about her age, and having that sense of a loss of youth, but also she's just not someone who has ever learnt to put on a camera smile. Someone picks up a camera, and most of us have a look that we drop into, a facial expression that we drop into quite easily. But my mum doesn't have that. And even if, lots of times I turn the sound off my phone camera, or keep taking photographs thinking that she might become accustomed to the camera being there and then become less self-conscious. It never really happened. She's always, there is a particular thing that, a very strong discomfort that my mother has with the camera. So I chose not to do direct portraits, but I did have this lovely experience with her where we were walking into the bushland that she cares for in her local area, and she was showing me through it, and we were talking about plants, and I had my camera with me, and I was taking photographs of the environment and of her, and this is right at the end of the project, and I really already had the images and my style and my repertoire of images for exhibition and so on. But it was something to do with her being very comfortable in the environment and having come through this long period of collaboration with me, and somehow all of that discomfort sort of dropped away. Plus she had her own little phone camera with her, and she was taking photographs at the same time. And I got a set of shots of her where it wasn't a direct portrait. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was standing in the bush. One of my favorite shots is her, and her face is obscured by some native trees, and all you see is this side profile of her body. She's holding her special tool for weeding and just kind of looking into the bushland. So they were I felt like they were they're portraits, but they're non-portraits, and it was, you know, it took a long time getting there, and I so the photographs not taken, in a sense, were really instrumental to me being able to achieve something that was much more reflective of who she is. And so that's sort of a long process. And so I suppose the importance of the missed photographs or the failed photographs were really crucial to that.
Wow, that's fascinating. I got before I got to say, I did see that. I think you had 3 photos on Instagram about your mother. One of your mother and one of the bush and the weeds, and then another of I think an implement, or just I think maybe a photo of your mother at work. Sort of put them together. I think so. It was really, really interesting. But it's been fascinating to learn more about that and what's behind those images as well. So, thank you. I know exactly the photo I haven't taken, and I remember it to the day at school in the 6th form, walking home rather than being in private study at school with the camera in my bag. And I was walking past the Kensington Hilton and walking in the opposite direction where these 4 really good-looking women. One was Carol Kenyon, who sang the with Heaven 17 on Temptation. One was one of the 2 singers in Loose Ends, and another was one of the singers with Everything But the Girl. After, I think, no, not Everything But the Girl. One band which Tracy Thorn was in but had left. And then there was another singer who I recognised from Top of the Pops over the years. And these 4 black women, all wearing houndstooth pleated trousers, white T-shirts and black leather jackets. They'd either been to a photo session or a music video or something like that. They looked amazing. They were all having a laugh and they were walking 4 abreast towards me. And I was thinking, I know who you are, and I could take a photo of you with this camera I have here, and it would be something extraordinary. And I absolutely looked down and walked straight past them because I was chicken, absolute chicken. And I think I was scared to ask them. I was scared to then tell them what to do in a set of photos. And as Natasha said, I don't. It's not just the frame. I have the poses I want them in. You know, there's this. It was just near the Northern Roundabout, so you have this great car backdrop and so on. I was just too chicken to ask them, and I remember it clear as day. You know, I know that it was black and white film I was carrying at HP4. I know that. I've got an idea of what the images would look like, and I regret it. I absolutely regret it. And should I ever come across a moment like that, I do push myself to ask. Tend to get no, sometimes get yes, but that's, you know, it's certainly not. It's a celebrity photo. But for me, as a 16, 17-year-old, I think it would have been a very important photo to take because these women were part of the culture that surrounded me. But for some reason, I was just too scared. And but I of course, I remember the moments this day. I remember it clear as day. That's mine.
It's almost like the moment is more poignant because we didn't take the photograph. Yeah. So one, you know, would remember
and more memorable. Yeah.
Because of the accents.
Who knows? You know, if I took the photo, I'd have been so sort of scared it would have been completely out of focus. You know, I had this thing about there'd be so much space above the heads because I didn't know an idea of like getting the photo, you know, getting the frame down. It would have been a pretty awful set of photos. but the memory is so strong. The memory is fantastic. So I'll hang on to that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things for me that's I've really learned from this conversation is that notion of, you know, what Natasha called the sort of frame head, the number of sort of virtual or non-existent photographs you have in the process, but then in hindsight as well, even down to remembering the camera and the film that was in the backpack for a photo that wasn't taken. The very last thing I wanted to ask was to look ahead, and earlier in the conversation, you know, this notion came up of, you know, where you might want to go as a photographer. I just want to slightly reframe that and ask each of you, looking ahead, where you might want to go as a photographer, or where you might want to go with this medium next. Is there a sense of what calls you, or a direction that you might choose to go in any aspect of your relationship to photography?
Something unexpected that came out of my last project was that fascination for the archive and how much you can draw out of an archival photograph. And you know, another aspect of my project was the albums themselves and the absences from them. So not just the photograph as the object, but the album as the object. And so that's a direction that I'm really interested in going further into. So I am starting to make some plans to revisit one of the towns where I grew up in. That's you know, my family spent 10 years there, and a significant image from my project came from the local historical society. And I follow them on Facebook, and I saw this photograph appear in which my mother was in the photograph, and it linked to a significant story from, you know, her life with my father, and I borrowed the photograph from them, and I've, you know, for many months now, I've wanted to go back and revisit that archive and take a scanner with me and just spend lots and lots of time looking through photographs of the town, of things that were happening at the time that we were there. So it's, you know, still relating it to my family history, but just sort of more broadly the culture of the town and the kind of the hidden stories in there. So that's something I'm starting to make plans to do now.
I've probably got a technical and a theme that I've been thinking about. So when I was last in the UK, I bought a Minolta TLR, and I still haven't got to grips with taking photos with it. They either turn out really brilliantly or they're awful, and the counter seems to slip. So it's kind of Russian roulette. So I want to kind of get a bit braver, but it's sort of the cost, you know, you put 12 frames in and they're all awful, and it's expensive, especially in New Zealand. So yeah, that's a technical challenge for me, getting to grips. It's a very different way of taking a photograph because you're looking down. It's actually great for street photography if you wanted to be a voyeur and not alert people to, you know, you're taking photographs because they don't have a clue. And then I vaguely had a kind of theme in my head, which sort of developed through my trip when I was going around Auckland, thinking about, obviously as my background working at library, but maybe it's sort of documenting bookshops, sort of quirky ones. And I saw some really unusual ones on my trip, which, you know, bookshops have gone through this sort of, you know, it feels like their heyday is gone, and they were really starting to become a bygone kind of concept because everyone's moving online, it's becoming digital. And then COVID hit, and there's been this resurgence. And I found some really interesting bookshops in Auckland. There was the women's bookshop in Ponsonby, which I think has a connection back to Women's Archive that I used to look after at Auckland Libraries. They used to be on another street, and then they kind of moved, and that's quite niche. There was a boat bookshop which I found down in the harbour by the Waitemata, by the water. Again, very niche, and a Wiccan bookshop. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting theme. I'm not sure how it's going to hang together, but it's got that sort of documentary kind of recording what's, you know, potentially going to be lost, but hopefully not. So yeah.
Oh, so that's fascinating. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things about COVID is, yeah, people love their books, but people have really gone away from the, well, as far as I can tell, gone away from the Amazon behemoth to look for the independent bookshops, to go online for their stock, which I think is really lovely. And so documenting these places, long may that continue, and long may they thrive. Personally, I hope that really hope that comes well. For me, I have immediate, I have immediate and future hopes. As you said in my introduction, lighting and composition. Certainly, lighting is. Learning more about that is important. I did get a set of lights for my 50th, and I have been very, as with that photo I'm taking, I've been very chicken about using them, and I'm going to be getting one out, and I've been looking at YouTube tutorials on how to use lights, and I'm going to test with that. The other aspect, I want to take longer exposures. It's a bit strange. One photo I took recently was, I've got it here, chap on YouTube, whose name I forget, I'll probably send it out to you, but he teaches how to take pinhole cameras with beer cans. So happily I got through quite a bit of Stella doing, sorry, Cronenberg.
Yeah, I've got one on my shelf, weirdly, now.
Absolutely.
With my, they're fun.
So yeah, totally. AJ Quinnell, I think, or Quinnell is, I think Quinnell is his surname. I'll look for him. And that was a 6-month pinhole image. There's a chap whose name I forget who gets commissioned to take photos of building projects, and he has 3-year exposures. So I don't think I'm going to go quite that far, but I'd like to do something along those lines. The other thing is the larger format. I also have a friend from my camera club gave me a Yashica Matte twin lens reflex, I think, which I have used, not much, not enough, but I'd like to use that more and more formally, I think. But I'd also like to go from medium format to large format photos. I would really like to see what I could play about with on with landscape or with portraits, even with larger format photos. They really interest me. The looking through the viewfinder of my twin lens, the beautiful image, the beautiful view you get through the viewfinder. I don't even need to take a photo. I just spend my time looking through it. And I think that it's going to be I've never taken a large format photo. I don't know if you have. I haven't taken large format Polaroids or anything like that. But I would love to get more into large format photography. There's something really quite fascinating about it, and yeah, eventually that's where I'd like to be shooting.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I think we've had this amazing journey into time and memory, stories, questions of power, from a collection of moments to these stories that get told and retold, and then we go beneath the surface to see what's been concealed, and then all of it kind of mixed in with these technical questions that are inherent to the medium. I'm grateful to all of you for sharing this journey from that first encounter to where you might be headed next. Natasha, Jonathan, Wendy, thank you so much for your time and for sharing this conversation with us across the time zones.